The year was 1950. In the town of Bethesda, Maryland, 5 police officers were called to a local motel, responding to a report of a guest causing a serious disturbance. When they arrived, the man's brother, whom we'll call David, pleaded with the officers not to arrest him. His brother, he insisted, didn't mean any harm. He was suffering from a severe mental health condition. As the police were questioning the agitated suspect, a man carrying a doctor's briefcase arrived at the scene. His name was Dr. Walter Jackson Freeman II, and, as it turned out, he had treated David's brother before. Dr. Freeman calmly asked David if he would like him to treat his brother right then and there. A quick procedure, he suggested, would certainly be a better outcome than a trip downtown in handcuffs. A desperate David agreed. Freeman then turned to the police officers and asked for their help in restraining the patient. Freeman opened his briefcase and took out a portable electroshock machine. He wrapped the electrodes around the patient's head and, with a sudden jolt of electricity, zapped him unconscious. Next, from his bag, Freeman produced a small mallet and a long, slender, ice pick-shaped instrument. He carefully placed the sharp point of the tool into the corner of the unconscious man's eye socket, just above the eyeball. And then, with a single, practiced flick of the wrist, he hammered the pick deep into his patient's brain. Freeman gave the spike a hard, sweeping twist. Then he calmly repeated the exact same process in the other eye. David and the 5 seasoned police officers could only watch in stunned, horrified silence as Freeman withdrew the instrument and casually wiped a few drops of blood from the man's cheek. David and the 5 seasoned police officers could only watch in stunned, horrified silence. Freeman calmly withdrew the instrument, wiped a few drops of blood from the unconscious man's cheek, and then casually began to pack his tools back into his briefcase. He turned to David and told him not to worry about the cost of the impromptu procedure. Insurance, he assured him, would cover his brother's lobotomy. When our bodies and our minds fail us, we trust our doctors to provide a solution. But medicine is not always an exact science, and sometimes the cure can be far worse than the disease. Welcome back to Medical Obscura. This is our second and final episode in our investigation into the rise and fall of the lobotomy, a surgical treatment once thought to cure a host of mental health conditions. In our previous installment, we discussed Gottlieb Burckhardt's initial, brutal attempts at psychosurgery and explored how Dr. Antonio Egas Moniz later refined and popularized the invention. In this episode, we will see how Dr. Walter J. Wright tore the lobotomy, pioneering a new, less invasive technique. Freeman II carried on that dark legacy, transforming the procedure with his own terrifying invention, the ice pick lobotomy. We will also investigate the complex reasons why this procedure remained so popular for so long, even after far more humane and effective treatments finally emerged. The story of the lobotomy begins in 1935, when the Portuguese neurologist Antonio Egas Moniz first introduced his prefrontal leucotomy to the world. This surgical procedure was, for a time, believed to be a cure-all for a wide range of mental health conditions, from schizophrenia to bipolar disorder. Moniz's procedure would even go on to win him the Nobel Prize in Medicine in 1949. Moniz's core theory was that he could treat these conditions by surgically severing what he believed were abnormal, fixed, neural connections between two key parts of the brain: the thalamus, the brain's emotional center, and the prefrontal cortex, the seat of our higher cognition. An ambitious American neurologist named Walter Jackson Freeman II was one of Moniz's earliest and most enthusiastic supporters. In 1935, Freeman was the head of the neurology department at George Washington University in Washington, D.C. He was a popular figure on campus, favored by his students, primarily for being a great showman. He instinctively understood the importance of keeping an audience engaged. He once famously told a colleague, "What the teacher has to say does not have to be important. Indeed, it does not even have to be true. But it has to be interesting." To that end, Freeman often used live patients in his lectures to illustrate medical concepts, rather than relying on boring textbook diagrams or preserved specimens. On one memorable occasion, he demonstrated the infantile behavior of some dementia patients by bringing an elderly woman on stage and bottle-feeding her in front of the class. His teaching style was so famously entertaining that students would often bring dates to his medical lectures. But professionally, Walter Freeman lived in the immense shadow of his grandfather, Dr. William Williams Keene, Jr. Dr. Keene was a legendary figure, the United States' first ever brain surgeon, and one of the first doctors in the world to successfully remove a brain tumor. Freeman knew he had enormous shoes to fill. But for the first part of his career, he toiled in relative obscurity, a well-regarded teacher, but not a pioneering researcher. That is, until he read Agus Moniz's groundbreaking paper on the lobotomy in 1936. Freeman was immediately inspired to duplicate and even surpass Moniz's success. He saw the lobotomy as the great uncharted frontier of American medicine. If he could become the face of this procedure in the United States, perhaps he could finally create a legacy that rivaled his grandfather's. But first, he needed a partner. Freeman was a neurologist, which meant he could diagnose and recommend treatments for the brain and nervous system. But legally, he was disallowed from performing surgery himself. He needed the skilled hands of a neurosurgeon to operate on his patients, and he found that partner in a man named Dr. James W. Watts. Watts was, in almost every way, Freeman's polar opposite. He was serious, meticulous, and strictly by the book. He believed that maintaining a perfectly sterile environment was a crucial, non-negotiable part of surgery. If a nurse so much as dared to sneeze in his operating room, Watts would have them immediately ejected. Freeman, on the other hand, openly scoffed at rules and conformity. He often skirted operating room regulations and was never particularly worried about sterile technique. Nevertheless, Watts was attracted to the idea of making medical history, and he eagerly joined Freeman's practice. In September of 1936, the duo performed the United States' first ever prefrontal lobotomy. Their patient was a 63-year-old woman named Alice Hammett. Alice had come to Freeman seeking help for her severe anxiety, insomnia, and depression. Another doctor of that era might have simply committed her to an asylum, But to Freeman and Watts, Alice was the perfect candidate for their new procedure. Alice initially agreed to the operation. But on the night before the surgery, she found out she would have to shave her head and immediately revoked her consent. Freeman, however, was not about to lose his first patient over something he considered so trivial. So he simply lied. He went to Alice and assured her that they would leave her hair completely intact. He felt that her vanity was far less important than her mental health. Alice, reassured, fell for Freeman's white lie. The following morning, Alice Hammett was sedated, her head was completely shaved, and she was taken into the operating room. Freeman began by instructing his partner, Dr. Watts, to drill 2 burr holes into her skull. Through these openings, they used a leucotome, the instrument designed by Moniz to slice into her brain tissue and destroy the neural connections between her prefrontal cortex and her thalamus. Afterwards, they stitched Alice up and took her to the recovery room. When Alice woke up, she was reportedly in great spirits. Her crippling anxiety and depression seemed to have vanished completely. Freeman, testing her, even asked how she felt about her newly shaved head. But even that, a source of such distress the night before, didn't seem to bother her in the slightest. Freeman and Watts knew, in that moment, that they were onto something big. As they grew more seasoned, the duo began to alter Agus Moniz's original methods, creating their own signature technique. They called it, simply, the Freeman-Watts procedure. Their new technique moved the placement of the burr holes higher up on the skull, which they believed gave them better access to the brain. For patients with more severe conditions, they also made additional, deeper cuts around the thalamus. Freeman even designed his own custom leucotome. His new instrument, which resembled a dull, curved letter opener, offered, in his view, more precision. And unlike Moniz, Freeman developed a preference for keeping his patients awake during the procedure, using only local anesthetic. He would often ask them to sing songs or recite phrases so he could monitor their cognitive condition as he worked. Then, Freeman would instruct Watts to cut deeper and deeper into the thalamus until the patient was no longer able to speak. Once a patient fell silent, Freeman considered the crucial connections to be successfully severed. During these surreal operations, Freeman would often ask his conscious patients strange, philosophical questions. On one occasion, he asked a subject on the operating table, "Does your conscience hurt?" The woman on the table reportedly answered, "I don't know where it is. It was down by my heart, but I can't feel it at all." Freeman claimed these bizarre conversations were a way to measure how severely the patient's neural circuits had been damaged. He called it his disorientation yardstick. It was also, he believed, a way to predict how the lobotomy would ultimately affect a patient's intellect. Generally, Freeman claimed that his patients retained their full intellectual ability after his procedure. But many other neurologists strongly disagreed. They used standardized tools, like IQ tests, to examine his patients after their recovery. And these independent tests consistently showed that the lobotomy had a significant negative effect on their cognitive abilities. Freeman was used to ignoring his academic detractors, but as a natural showman, he knew that public opinion was what truly mattered. He would often go directly to the popular press, like the New York Times, with his glowing results, long before ever publishing them in peer-reviewed medical journals. Eventually, Freeman became a popular and celebrated public figure. He even produced and starred in his own instructive videos demonstrating the Freeman-Watts procedure. The duo quickly became the most famous lobotomists in all of America. Then, in 1942, Freeman discovered a new, vast, and untapped resource of potential patients: American military veterans. When World War II finally came to a close, the Department of Veterans Affairs, or VA, was completely overwhelmed with men returning from battle. Many of them suffered from severe, debilitating mental health conditions. It was estimated that 1.2 million veterans were admitted to VA hospitals with neurological conditions, a number roughly double the amount of veterans who had suffered major physical injuries. Their most common affliction was what we now call post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. PTSD is a neurological condition caused by experiencing or witnessing deeply stressful or traumatic events. During such an experience, the body releases a flood of hormones and neurotransmitters to react to the situation. These chemicals are the body's way of preparing for danger by improving reaction time, heightening the senses, and dulling pain. But they also play a critical role in fear conditioning. During periods of prolonged, intense stress, like combat, an individual's mind can get permanently stuck in this fight-or-flight mode, their body maintaining abnormally high levels of stress hormones. If this state lasts longer than a month, it's considered PTSD. The symptoms typically fall into three main categories: intrusive thoughts, like flashbacks and nightmares; hyperarousal, which includes impulsivity, insomnia, and anger; and deactivation, meaning emotional numbness, avoidance, and depression. The overwhelmed VA hospitals all over the country were inspired by the reported success of Freeman and Watts. Desperate for a solution, they started lobotomizing veterans who presented with severe PTSD symptoms. By 1949, these military infirmaries were performing an average of 48 lobotomy procedures every single month. The Department of Veterans Affairs even issued an official endorsement of the practice, making the lobotomy seem even more legitimate to the public. It seemed as though Walter Freeman was finally going to rival and perhaps even surpass his grandfather's legacy. Meanwhile, a deep professional jealousy was growing inside him. Freeman was growing envious of his partner's exclusive power to operate. He coveted the prestige that came with the title of neurosurgeon, and he reportedly took great pride whenever a newspaper would accidentally refer to him as a surgeon. Instead of correcting the misconception, he decided he wanted to embody it. One morning, his partner, James Watts, came down with a cold and couldn't come in to work. A lobotomy had been scheduled for that day. But instead of canceling the procedure, Freeman decided he would perform it himself. Just as Freeman began to make the first incision, however, another surgeon walked into the operating room. Freeman managed to calm the other doctor down long enough to finish his unauthorized lobotomy. But immediately afterwards, the surgeon filed a formal complaint with the hospital director. Freeman was officially reprimanded for his actions, but without much serious consequence. He was simply told that if he truly wanted to operate, he would have to formally apply for surgical privileges. By the late 1940s, the standard prefrontal lobotomy was facing larger logistical obstacles. The procedure, which cost hundreds of dollars, wasn't always covered by insurance. Would-be patients knew it was highly invasive and required weeks, if not months, of painful recovery. But where others saw insurmountable drawbacks, Walter Freeman saw an opportunity. Perhaps, he reasoned, lobotomies would be more appealing to the masses if they weren't really considered surgery at all. Freeman came to believe that almost anyone could be trained to perform the operation, and that it could be done cheaply, quickly, and effectively. And he was determined to show the world how. By 1945, Dr. Walter Freeman and his partner, Dr. James Watts, had successfully popularized the prefrontal lobotomy across the United States. But Freeman was already dreaming bigger. He believed there had to be a faster and cheaper way for patients to receive the same therapeutic effects. A method that didn't require a certified surgeon, an operating room, or drilling holes in the skull. He began to search for a new way to reach the thalamus. But the thalamus is located deep inside the brain, surrounded by delicate and vital tissue. One wrong move with a surgical instrument could leave a patient permanently disabled, or even kill them. His research for a new, non-cranial approach eventually led him to the obscure work of an Italian psychiatrist named Amaro Fiamberti. Amaro Fiamberti was the director of a psychiatric hospital in Italy, and he had been an early adopter of Agus Maniz's original procedure. But in 1937, he developed his own radical, new version of the lobotomy. Instead of accessing the brain by drilling through the thick bone of the skull, Fiamberti realized he could reach the frontal lobes through a much more fragile entry point. He would puncture the thin bone at the back of the eye socket with a long, sharp needle. Then he would inject pure alcohol to sever the connections between the prefrontal cortex and the thalamus. Fiamberti only performed about 100 of these procedures before the outbreak of World War II disrupted his trials. His controversial methods never gained traction outside of Italy. That is, until 1945, when Walter Freeman got his hands on Fiamberti's research. Freeman immediately believed that Fiamberti's transorbital approach, through the eye socket, was the key to creating his dream of a cheap, fast, and effective lobotomy, one that didn't require an expensive operating room. But Freeman knew he couldn't use injected alcohol. As Agus Maniz had discovered a decade earlier, that technique was too imprecise and destroyed too much surrounding brain tissue. Instead, Freeman began to search for a tool that was both strong enough to penetrate the bone of the eye socket and yet slender and precise enough to then be used to cut the targeted neural tissue. He began testing a variety of instruments on cadavers at the local morgue. But most standard medical instruments, like long spinal puncture needles, would either bend or break against the bone. He was stumped. Until, the story goes, he was rummaging through his own kitchen drawers at home. There, he stumbled upon a Uline brand ice pick. The simple kitchen tool was perfect. It was strong enough to puncture the thin bone of the orbit and slender enough to be manipulated to slice the brain's delicate neural connections. It was the humble instrument that would come to define Walter Freeman's dark career. Freeman called his new procedure the transorbital lobotomy. But it would soon become known by its much more common and much more infamous name, the ice pick lobotomy. In January of 1946, Freeman was ready to use it on a live patient for the first time. His first patient was a woman named Ellen Ionesco. She was a 29-year-old wife and mother who suffered from debilitating episodes of mania and depression. She had suicidal thoughts and was sometimes violent towards her own husband and daughter. Ellen's condition wasn't considered severe enough by other doctors to warrant a full prefrontal lobotomy, but her husband was desperate. They had tried every other available treatment, but nothing had proven effective. He approached Dr. Freeman for help, and Ellen, just as eager to be cured, agreed to the experimental new procedure. Freeman didn't have an anesthesiologist or even an operating room. Instead, he simply had Ellen lie down on a couch in his office. He had her limbs restrained. To numb the pain and render her compliant, he placed electrodes on her temples and administered 2 jolts of electroshock, rendering her unconscious. Then Freeman sterilized his ice pick. He lifted Ellen's eyelid and placed the sharp point of the instrument into the inner corner of her right eye, at the tear duct. He carefully lined up the shaft of the ice pick with her nose, angling it towards the center of her brain. Then he took a small mallet and tapped it firmly. The point penetrated the thin bone of her eye socket and entered Ellen's frontal lobe. With one quick, sweeping twist of the pick, Freeman severed the connections. He then repeated the process on the other side. The entire procedure took less than 5 minutes. When Ellen woke up, she was disoriented and had trouble walking. The ice pick had left her with 2 severe black eyes. But there were no stitches and no bandages required. Freeman followed up with Ellen a few weeks later. She told him that her suicidal thoughts and her violent outbursts were completely gone. She went on to lead a seemingly normal life, raising her daughter and working in her husband's jewelry store. Not only was Freeman's first transorbital lobotomy an apparent success, it had cost a tiny fraction of the time, money, and manpower of a traditional prefrontal lobotomy. But Freeman couldn't tell the world about his invention. Not yet. He knew he needed more proof, more data of its efficacy. And so, over the next few months, Freeman began to perform the procedure secretly in his private office on more and more patients. He performed the procedure secretly in his office until, on his 10th clandestine lobotomy, his partner, Dr. James Watts, caught him in the act. Watts was utterly horrified to find his partner in their shared office hammering an ice pick into a patient's eye socket. He was furious that Freeman would conduct such a delicate and dangerous procedure without a trained surgeon, without a sterile environment, without even a nurse or proper anesthesia. Watts immediately threatened to quit their shared practice if Freeman didn't discontinue his barbaric new work. Freeman refused. The ensuing fallout was bitter and absolute, and it ended their successful 10-year partnership. Watts, in his anger, swore that he would never allow a transorbital lobotomy to be performed at George Washington Hospital ever again. Interestingly, that didn't prove to be the case. Over the years, even the meticulous Dr. Watts eventually saw some value in the speed and simplicity of the transorbital lobotomy. Records show he went on to perform the procedure at least 28 times himself during the 1950s. He would later, inevitably, admit that the procedure wasn't quite as dangerous as he had initially believed. But now, working alone, Walter Freeman was finally free to refine and promote his transorbital lobotomy without restriction. Over the next decade, he perfected his technique. He no longer needed a surgeon to follow his instructions. In fact, as he would prove, almost anyone could be trained to perform an ice pick lobotomy, just about anywhere. However, the transorbital lobotomy did have its own unique set of gruesome problems. The most common was that, sometimes, the very tip of the ice pick would break off and remain lodged deep inside a patient's skull. While this often wasn't enough to cause immediate, catastrophic damage, the metal fragment would frequently cause severe and sometimes deadly infections. Additional, traditional surgery was then required to retrieve the broken pieces. This, of course, completely undermined Freeman's marketing of the transorbital lobotomy as a simple, non-surgical alternative. So, in 1948, to solve this technical problem, Freeman designed a new, custom instrument to replace the common kitchen ice pick. He called it the orbitoclast. The orbitoclast was shaped much like an ice pick, but it was slightly longer and had a heavier, graduated handle on the end. It was far more durable than an ice pick, and its design gave Freeman more control and leverage during the procedure. Freeman began to sell the idea of the orbitoclast as a superior, more refined instrument. He claimed that with this new tool, the transorbital lobotomy was now a much milder treatment. And because of this, he argued it could be useful for a much wider variety of conditions, like moderate mania and depression, things that would never have warranted a full surgical lobotomy before. What the general public didn't know, however, was that the results of these transorbital lobotomies varied wildly. In many cases, it brought the same devastating relief that the original prefrontal lobotomy did. Namely, it dulled the outward symptoms of a mental health condition, but at the terrible cost of the patient's core personality and emotional life. These people often lost their ability to engage in normal social behavior. They overate, overslept, and lost all sense of self-motivation. But Walter Freeman chose to focus only on the fact that they no longer suffered from their original, overt symptoms. For him, this was the only barometer of success. Meanwhile, many patients and their desperate families were attracted to the apparent ease of the procedure. A transorbital lobotomy was far less grueling than a prefrontal one. Instead of weeks in a hospital, patients often returned home the very same day. Freeman would assure them there was no shaved head, no ugly scar, only a pair of black eyes that would heal quickly. One thing he didn't advertise, of course, was the sheer crudeness of the procedure. It left some patients with permanent seizure disorders. Some lost their lives right there on the operating table. Others died days or weeks later from undetected internal bleeding. Still, for many desperate people, the promise of a quick, simple cure far outweighed the hidden risks. Freeman's method was also significantly cheaper. In 1949, a transorbital lobotomy cost just $25. A prefrontal lobotomy, by contrast, cost 12 times that amount. Despite some of its apparent benefits, The transorbital lobotomy drew harsh and immediate criticism from many in the established medical field. In 1947, one of Freeman's own peers, the Yale physiologist John Fulton, wrote to him in disgust. "What are these terrible things I hear about you doing?" he asked. "Lobotomies in your office with an ice pick? Why don't you use a shotgun? It would be quicker." But these criticisms did nothing to discourage Freeman's practice. In fact, he seemed to thrive on the controversy. He began performing his procedure everywhere. He made house calls to private residences. He went to jails to treat prisoners. He even, as we saw, visited that roadside motel in Bethesda, Maryland during a police standoff. And if Walter Freeman's lobotomy was a three-ring circus, it seemed that nearly everyone wanted to be part of the show. Freeman began spending his summers touring state hospitals all over the United States, often in a van he nicknamed the Lobotomobile. His stated goal was to train local neurologists, nurses, and psychiatrists in the art of his transorbital lobotomy. At each stop, hospital and asylum staff would gather around as the master showman, Dr. Freeman, demonstrated his technique on their own real patients. His performances were legendary. Sometimes, for dramatic effect, he would place orbitoclasts in both of a patient's eyes at once and hammer them in simultaneously, just to get a rise out of the audience. On one infamous occasion, he performed a veritable carousel of 25 lobotomies in a single afternoon. His brutal methods may have repulsed some of the observers, but the majority of the cash-strapped and overcrowded hospitals eagerly adopted the transorbital lobotomy as a common treatment. It was fast, cheap, and it produced quiet, manageable patients. By the 1950s, 30% of all psychosurgeries performed in the United States were Freeman's transorbital lobotomies, and that percentage grew every single year. However, across the Atlantic, in a laboratory in France, a new movement in psychiatric treatment was quietly taking shape. A discovery that would mean the end of the lobotomy, and the end of Walter Freeman's dark reign. Dr. Walter Freeman's ice pick lobotomy had, by the end of the 1940s, become almost synonymous with mental health treatment in America. He had successfully taken his show on the road, offering his signature procedure at patients' homes, in prisons, and even in roadside motels. Meanwhile, in a laboratory in France, a pharmaceutical company had accidentally stumbled upon a new drug with extraordinary and unforeseen properties, one that would ultimately threaten Walter Freeman's entire legacy. In 1951, a French company called Rhone Poulenc was searching for new anesthetics to be used during surgery. One of their new experimental drugs, a chemical called chlorpromazine, was the first to show promising results. However, a French Navy surgeon named Henri Laborit soon noticed that chlorpromazine had other, very interesting side effects. He found that in low doses, the drug not only calmed his patients, but it also significantly lowered their body temperature. At the time, the deliberate cooling of the body was a common, if brutal, treatment for severe emotional distress in asylums. Patients would sometimes be restrained and submerged in tubs of ice-cold water for hours on end. When it was all over, the patient would often appear much calmer. Dr. Laborit believed that chlorpromazine could provide a much easier and far more humane way to achieve the same calming results. In 1952, Laborit tested his theory on patients at a military hospital in Paris. His first subject was a 24-year-old patient who suffered from severe psychotic episodes. When Dr. Laborit injected the man with chlorpromazine, it didn't just lower his body temperature. To his astonishment, it seemed to wipe away his psychosis entirely. Chlorpromazine works as a neurotransmitter antagonist. Neurotransmitters are the chemical messengers released by one neuron to communicate with another. To get there, they travel across a microscopic gap called a synapse. You can think of a synapse like a street between two office buildings, and the neurotransmitters are the cars traveling from one location to the other. The neuron's receptors are the spaces in the parking lot. There are many different types of neurotransmitters, each with a unique function, much like different types of vehicles have different uses. The chemical makeup of the drug chlorpromazine is very similar to a specific neurotransmitter called dopamine. So, when a person takes chlorpromazine, the drug molecule essentially fills up all the parking spaces in the brain that dopamine is supposed to take. This action dampens or dramatically decreases the communication between certain neurons. It is theorized that conditions like schizophrenia and bipolar disorder are caused, in part, by too much dopamine being released by the brain's neurons. So, by blocking the receptors, chlorpromazine prevents this excess dopamine from delivering its powerful signal. Although the effects of a single dose only lasted for a few hours, doctors believed that a constant, managed supply of chlorpromazine could allow patients who were once considered hopelessly ill to resume an ordinary life outside the walls of an asylum. And just like that, the modern psychopharmacology industry was born. In 1954, the FDA approved chlorpromazine for use in the United States under the brand name Thorazine. It was brilliantly and effectively marketed as a chemical lobotomy. It promised all the supposed benefits of the surgery with none of the controversy or the irreversible brain damage. The drug was far cheaper and more versatile than surgery, and psychiatric facilities across the country quickly and eagerly adopted it. If the side effects became too much for a patient, their dosage could be easily and safely adjusted. By the end of 1954, an estimated 2 million patients were being prescribed chlorpromazine. Hospitals began ordering more and more doses of the new antipsychotics, and they made fewer and fewer calls to lobotomists like Walter Freeman. Freeman, for his part, stubbornly believed that these new psychopharmaceuticals were just a passing fad. He pointed to Thorazine's significant side effects, which could include restlessness, muscle rigidity, and uncontrollable tremors. He felt it was only a matter of time before the public and the medical community grew disillusioned with these chemical cures and returned to the clean finality of psychosurgery. Unfortunately for him, that day never came. Though Freeman continued to build relationships with his existing patients, he was unable to garner new clients. His opportunities began to dry up in Washington, D.C. So, in 1954, he and his family moved to Los Altos, California, hoping to start fresh on the West Coast. He and his family moved to Los Altos, California, to start fresh. But now, desperate for new patients, Walter Freeman's criteria for administering a lobotomy became dangerously flexible. One of his most famous and controversial patients from this era was a 12-year-old boy named Howard Dully. Howard's stepmother, Lou, had approached Freeman, asking for help with what she described as her defiant and ill-behaved stepson. It remains unclear what, if any, legitimate condition Freeman actually diagnosed Howard with. But he advised the Dully family that a transorbital lobotomy would almost certainly make their young boy more agreeable. And in December of 1960, with his stepmother's consent, Howard Dully received an ice-pick lobotomy. Meanwhile, the tide of public opinion was rapidly and decisively turning against the procedure. In 1958, Tennessee Williams's powerful play, Suddenly Last Summer, debuted on Broadway. It depicted the lobotomy as a barbaric method of control, used to silence inconvenient people. The influential novels The Bell Jar and One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, both published in 1962, also portrayed the lobotomy as a soul-crushing operation, a procedure that stripped a person of their vitality and their independent thought. The cultural tides had changed. Even mainstream physicians now openly wondered why anyone would recommend a brutal, irreversible brain surgery when a drug like Thorazine was proving to be so effective. Still, there were a few patients who remained fiercely loyal to Dr. Freeman and who continued to trust his methods. In fact, for many, the lobotomy's greatest asset may have been Freeman's own charismatic personality. His wit, his confidence, and his intelligence won his patients' absolute trust. He maintained close, personal relationships with some of them for decades. But the outside world was growing increasingly hostile. In 1961, Freeman was giving a lecture on the lobotomy in San Francisco when the crowd turned against him. In 1961, Walter Freeman was giving a lecture on the lobotomy in San Francisco when the crowd grew openly hostile towards him and his methods. Growing frustrated and angry, Freeman dramatically overturned a box containing 500 Christmas cards he claimed to have received from his grateful patients. He then shouted at his critics in the audience, "How many Christmas cards did you get from your patients?" Needless to say, this theatrical outburst did little to help his deteriorating public image. Then, in 1967, Freeman performed his final and fatal procedure at Herrick Memorial Hospital in Berkeley, California. His patient, a woman named Helen Mortensen, also happened to be one of his very first transorbital lobotomy patients from back in 1946. Over the intervening years, they had kept in touch, and whenever Helen's symptoms of mental distress returned, she would see Dr. Freeman for what she called a tune-up. She felt his procedure worked better for her than the new drug Thorazine ever had. As he had done countless times before, Freeman shocked Helen into unconsciousness before angling the orbitoclast into the corner of her eye. He raised his mallet and struck. But this time, something went wrong. Freeman's instrument cut too deep into Helen's frontal lobe, severing a major blood vessel. Her brain began to bleed uncontrollably. 3 days later, Helen Mortensen died of a massive brain hemorrhage. The Herrick Hospital administration was furious. They immediately and permanently pulled Freeman's medical credentials. He would never be allowed to perform another lobotomy again. Freeman, now barred from practicing his signature technique, spent the rest of his days on the road, following up with his old patients in his lobotomobile. His final, obsessive goal was to gather what he believed would be irrefutable scientific evidence that the lobotomy did, in fact, help people. It was his last, desperate attempt to salvage his own tarnished legacy. While many of his patients had indeed returned to their families or pursued careers, many others, like Howard Dully, felt that Freeman's lobotomy had taken something essential from them, that it had broken them in some fundamental way. As the public gradually learned about the true, devastating cost of the lobotomy, they realized they had been sold a lie. Freeman didn't cure his patients. He hid their symptoms from the world, and often from the patients themselves. The only person who couldn't seem to see the truth was Freeman. He remained consumed by the mythos he had built around himself. He went to his grave in 1972, still adamant that the lobotomy was the most effective psychiatric treatment known to man. The controversy, however, outlived both Freeman and Moniz. In 2005, a woman named Christine Johnson began a public petition to revoke Moniz's 1949 Nobel Prize. Her own grandmother had suffered from hallucinations and depression long after her lobotomy in 1952. The procedure, she said, had only destroyed her ability to form emotional connections. Mrs. Johnson argued that had Moniz not won the prestigious award, it might have saved her family and thousands of others from that same heartbreak. The Nobel Foundation ultimately responded, stating that, as a matter of policy, they do not revoke prizes. The lobotomy was once envisioned as a way to free millions from the torment of mental illness. Today, the procedure seems utterly barbaric, but in its time, in a world without other options, it was seen by many as an act of mercy. And in some ways, its legacy continues. Modern psychosurgery still exists, in rare cases, for conditions like drug-resistant epilepsy and severe OCD. But these new procedures are infinitely more precise and targeted. Before we judge the actions of men like Walter Freeman and Egos Moniz too harshly, perhaps we must first ask ourselves, are we doing any better? The overprescription of psychiatric drugs is a massive, multi-billion-dollar industry, and its own efficacy is constantly being questioned. It forces us to confront a difficult question. What treatments that we consider advanced and humane today will be viewed as barbaric and ineffective by the historians of the future? The story of the lobotomy is a dark and complex chapter in our medical history. A chilling reminder of what can happen when desperation, ambition, and a flawed understanding of the human mind collide. If you wish to uncover more of these forgotten stories, subscribe to Medical Obscura and press the notification bell. Join us as we continue to explore the shadows where science and the unexplained intersect. We have many more cases to open.